Dr. Rick Hanson. He is our guest tonight because initially he was going to be coming to Charlottesville in person and be a guest at UVA. And he was going to come to our Sangha. And when UVA closed down because on-grounds classes, he kindly agreed to appear and come here and meet with us virtually. So as most of you know, Rick is a psychologist, a Dharma teacher, and has a deep interest in the meeting of modern neuroscience and the ancient contemplative practices. He's taught at major universities, just giving you background, and some of you well know this already perhaps. He's taught at major universities, meditation centers, and other institutions around the world. He's also a New York Times best-selling author, and his books reflect the interest that he's had in the meeting of neuroscience and contemplative practices. So just to give you the title of his other books, his previous books, they include Resilient, Hardwiring Happiness, Buddha's Brain, Just One Thing, and Mother Nurture. And now his most recent book, Neuro Dharma, a new science, ancient wisdom, and 7 practices of the highest happiness. And you can order a Neuro Dharma on Rick's website. And I believe Judy had a message up there as well as to ordering Rick's book, Neuro Dharma. I hope that tonight you will get excited about the book. Again, Rick is doing groundbreaking work in connecting and showing us in ways we can understand, those of us who are not scientists, how does neuroscience fit in with the Dharma. So tonight, what Rick is going to be doing, he's going to be guiding us in practice, teaching, and conversation about Neuro Dharma. And our program tonight is pretty much going to follow our usual IMCC pattern. And that is, first we'll have a guided meditation, a short break, and then a talk, followed by a period for formal discussion. And during that time, Rick will answer your questions. So first of all, the meditation and talk are titled The Neurology of Awakening. They focus on the truly embodied practice, illustrated by 7 practices of awakening that are explored in Neuro Dharma, and they have particular application to the challenges and fears of our times, including the COVID crisis, as well as have application to the farthest reaches of human consciousness. So it's a big agenda for one evening, but I'm sure it's going to be great. So let me say something about submitting questions. Rick is happy to answer questions if you have them. So if you do, during Rick's talk, which is going to follow the meditation, if you'd like to ask Rick's questions, you're invited to submit them online in the chat box using the chat function. In case you're not familiar with it, and I know many of you are, but in case you're not, you can take a look. The chat function icon appears on the bottom of your screen. You can click on it, a window appears, the chat window on the right of your screen. And if you're on a mobile device, then a phone, tablet, tap the screen, select more, and chat will open. Type your question at the bottom, press enter, and your question is going to be sent to Jeff as our IMCC host. And we will select from them questions that have been submitted, and I will present them to Rick, those who selected, and he'll respond. So having said all of that, Rick, let's turn the program over to you now. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all, and I feel like I'm among my Dharma family, my Dharma friends and sisters, and I appreciate that. And I went to school, in effect, with Jean and with Susan, and I've know, of course, John and maybe some others of you. So it's a real good feeling for me of being in community here among friends. I'll say a couple of words about the meditation we'll do, and then we'll have a break and we can talk more about this. So as you know, the Buddha said that there are 3 fundamental pillars of practice that we are to cultivate. We are to develop sila, samadhi, and panya, generally translated or often translated as sila, morality, restraint, virtue, samadhi, concentration, mindfulness, and panya, wisdom, in part based on the development of Vipassana, penetrating insight. So these are qualities that we develop in ourselves. Similarly, we may be familiar with the notion of the Brahma Viharas, the divine abodes, the dwelling places. Vihara is a dwelling place. Where does our heart dwell? Where do we abide? In compassion, kindness, altruistic joy, happiness for the happiness of others, and equanimity. Well, here too are qualities that we develop, we cultivate over time. Well, for cultivation, for development, for including its elements that have to do with healing, as that proceeds, apart from whatever might mysteriously be supernatural or transcendental, other than that, we are left with causes and conditions within the natural, ordinary, conditioned Big Bang universe in which we reside. And in terms of the development of virtue, mindfulness and wisdom, or compassion, kindness, altruistic joy and equanimity, and other qualities that are developed, they must involve underlying changes in the body. Otherwise, we're left with magic. So in terms of underlying changes in the body that are the objectively embodied basis for these qualities in our experience, in our minds, in our consciousness, very broadly defined, those developments occur, those changes that are lasting occur primarily through changes of neural structure and function, which mainly happen in the 3 pounds of tofu-like tissue inside the coconut. So we now have an historically unprecedented opportunity these days to begin to consider what actually is that embodied basis. How does it occur, and how can we use that knowledge in practical ways? The Buddha did not need an MRI or an EEG to become awakened. I'm not saying that Neuro Dharma is necessary or that it's an improvement on the perfectly sufficient Buddha Dharma. On the other hand, I think it can be useful. I think it's respectful of causes and conditions and dependent origination to explore what's actually happening in the body as the mind awakens. And it's a way for us to individualize practice and accelerate it for householders who are deeply interested in practice and are not able to go through the kind of 24/7, day in and day out, grinding and polishing of monastic life. So in that context, in the latest book, I explore 7 ways of being, 7 qualities that I think certainly are major, if not the major aspects of awakened mind, and then which are also available to us to develop along the way. So the 7 are steadiness of mind. Again, I'm clustering material in these 7 clusters. Steadiness of mind, warmth of heart, compassion, kindness, fullness, which for me includes equanimity, upekkha, a sense of balance and contentment, so that the underlying basis for craving starts to decrease. Those 3 cluster, we have a feeling for those often, a sense of steadiness, lovingness, and fullness. Then 3 other qualities might seem a little more subtle, but they're familiar to us, and we really see them manifest in people who are mature, really mature in their practice, a sense of wholeness, everything included, nothing left out, nothing disowned or pushed away, resting in a sense of being in which doing is occurring, wholeness. Then we have nowness, really being here now, really being at the front edge of now, as it is continually updated, even as we reside in anicca, radical impermanence, radical transience of all experiences. Nowness, 5th quality. Opening into allness, a sense truly of inner being, as Thich Nhat Hanh puts it, truly the feeling of what we know intellectually, that we are a local expression of the whole universe, entwined with culture and humanity and other people, and living out, in a way, our history in this moment. So how do we actually soften the boundary between self and world and relax the apparent self? How do we really appreciate anatta, emptiness, exist in emptiness in a real way? How do we really do that? How do we really open into a non-dual sense of everything while respecting the mind-body process of each person rippling along. And then last, timelessness is my word for really exploring squarely this really important word the Buddha used, translated often in English as unconditioned, unfabricated, in which arguably he was pointing to something that is beyond ordinary reality, beyond conditioned reality as the unconditioned, or alternately as some friends and teachers of mine, people like Lee Brasington, who operate, or Andy Alinsky, certainly Stephen Batchelor, entirely within a secular frame, understand unconditionality, the ultimate refuge that is distinct from conditioned phenomena within the natural frame. Okay, but I think it's also possible to explore it in a way that's, I think, more Mahayana, if you will, definitely more Pure Land, as potentially transcendental. So these are the 7 qualities that I'm interested in reverse engineering in a respectful way in the confines of a single book. Although I've taught this material twice over a 10-day meditation retreat. We'll take a day each for each one of these 7 qualities. I'm going to move through them fairly briskly in a 40-minute meditation. So to repeat, we can be aware of ourselves, the degree to which now there is or is not the presence of steadiness, lovingness, fullness, wholeness, nowness, allness, and even timelessness. It's a way of talking about in the fulfillment or fruition or full development of these qualities, the pinnacle of human possibility, reached through many different routes or traditions around the world. Buddhism's just one of them. I think we find these same 7 qualities developed in all the routes up the mountain of awakening, and we see that, in effect, these same 7 steps taken again and again and again, no matter which route we follow up the mountain of awakening. And these are steps we can take ourselves. And I'll name them now as practices, and we'll segue into a meditation that will be much simpler than this little introduction that I've offered here. We can steady the mind, warm the heart, rest in fullness, be wholeness, receive nowness, open into allness, and find timelessness. We can do this, and we can deepen in this bit by bit, synapse by synapse, in our practice every day. So with this as a kind of soft entry into a meditation, I'll offer some suggestions. I'll try to say as little as possible over the next 35 minutes. Establishing, as in most cases, people with significant practice history, a basic sense of steadiness of mind, present moment awareness, in a posture that's comfortable and alert, eyes open or closed. Finding some object of attention, such as the feeling of breathing, as an anchor, stabilizing presence. And in this stable presence, being aware of, perhaps gently encouraging or inviting, a warmth of heart, kindness, compassion, the simple feeling maybe of being cared about and caring. In this meditation, I'm not doing a classic choiceless awareness practice where we make next to no efforts inside our mind. This is more of a bhavana practice, a cultivation practice. It's an absorption practice in which we seek to rest our being increasingly in certain qualities, such as stable presence, steadiness of mind, lovingness. And third, a sense of growing enoughness, gratitude, contentment with the moment as it is, letting go of various aspects of craving. No need to resist anything unpleasant, no need to grasp after anything pleasant. Instead, finding a growing peacefulness and contentment inside, a growing calm. There could be a growing sense of ease as these three qualities come together: steadiness, lovingness, and fullness. Abiding stably with a warm heart in a growing equanimity. resting steadily in a loving peacefulness. Around this core of being might be swirling sounds, thoughts, feelings. There might be anxiety or stress or pain in the body. Passing through awareness, it's all okay. It's all okay. While dwelling increasingly in the sense of loving peacefulness. On this foundation of steadiness, lovingness, and fullness, I'm going to suggest that we explore these four other qualities, but if they seem abstract or you lose touch with them, just come back to this foundation. Sense of loving peacefulness, peaceful lovingness. So on this foundation, see if you can get a growing sense of your body as a whole. Many sensations in it, but your body experienced increasingly as one unified whole. Many different sensations in the body known together in the present as a whole. Going at your own pace here, I will suggest that you include sounds amidst sensations as a whole experience continuously. And you might gradually include thoughts and everything else occurring in the field of awareness as a single whole in the present. Consciousness as a whole, mind as a whole. It can be useful to have a sense of widening awareness in all directions. Including the element of awareness also, mind as a whole, consciousness as a whole. As the sense of the whole deepens, it can start to enter into what could be called singleness of mind or unification of consciousness, ekaggata, for those who are familiar with that factor of deep absorption. You are simply being yourself in the broadest sense, awareness included, as a whole. Suffering tends to decrease, struggle falls away as we open wider and wider into being ourselves entirely, continuously, undivided. And then fifth, as we rest in this quality of being ourselves most fully, we can deliberately focus more and more on the sense of the continual updating of consciousness, feeling alerted continually by the arising present, even as it disappears, even as it passes away. It's like living really close to the front edge of now, in the present, continually letting go, receiving nowness as it passes on by. It helps to not try to know things, not try to control things, not try to make sense of things. Getting really close to the arising sense of form in the aggregates, just the bare awareness of what's arising as it passes through. Abiding as oneself as a whole, peacefully, warm-heartedly, steadily, living at the front edge of now. Really being here now. freshness of the present. And then in the sixth practice of really experiencing what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing, I call opening into allness, it's to help ourselves actually feel what we know to be true, that this moment of consciousness as a whole, emerging in the present as it passes away, is a local quivering in the vast tapestry or network of reality. The world is rippling into us, we're rippling out into the world, softening of edges, relaxing of self, a vulnerability that recognizes our dependencies, with also an awestruck gratitude and how we are being lived by the universe, as the universe, continually. One way into this is to recognize that we are inhaling the gifts of green growing things, powered by a ball of burning gas over 90 million miles away. Receiving sunlight with every breath. It's okay if it's conceptual at first, that's how it starts, but then we feel it more and more. Wow. There might be a thank you, a sense of awe, wonder, and so many countless causes and conditions that occurred so that this moment of hearing and thinking and liking and disliking could be occurring as your consciousness now. You might have a sense of what Dogen was pointing toward in his statement that to forget the self is to perceive oneself as all things. And then in the last couple of minutes here, I'd like to name the seventh of finding timelessness and getting a sense of that which is more enduring, that which is spacious, that which has stillness, that which perhaps is the farthest shore, beyond the beyond, not subject to arising and passing away, unconditioned. And I will quote here from Thich Nhat Hanh and then be quiet for a couple minutes and then ring the bell. Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "Things appear and disappear according to causes and conditions. The true nature of things is not being born and not dying. Our true nature is the nature of no birth and no death, and we must touch our true nature in order to be free." Well, welcome back. First, I'd like to acknowledge that if you're like me, you may still be feeling somewhat meditative. And I recall Gil Fronsdal, a key teacher of my own, who said that we should finish a meditation like a runner finishing a race, kind of let your momentum carry you through the formal end and protect whatever beneficial that you've cultivated in yourself. So I'm going to try to do some of that myself here. I want to acknowledge that that particular meditation is completely ambitious. I just went for it. And it's okay if it's a little ragged. As I said, I took 10 days to go through those 7 practices with a day of prep before and after, 1 day each. So there's a lot of development in them, particularly the more subtle ones, I think, to really stabilize steadiness of mind. You know, it's pretty foundational. A lot of us who've been at it for a while have that down, but to really get a sense of yourself as a whole in the present, really feeling the ways that you are the world rippling through you, in the moment. And I'm still working on some of that myself, especially then the sense of the unconditioned. What? So it's okay. I just want to acknowledge, though, that it was an ambitious meditation. I wonder if what I could do is read the first paragraph of my book, which makes a point, and then I want to also talk about how all this is relevant in the time of Corona, and then open it up for your questions and discussion and comments. Okay, so so you recall the cover. It's got the motif of the mountain. Looks kind of neurological on the bottom. Looks kind of woo-woo on the top. Path of practice here. So the opening chapter is titled Mind in Life, taken from Evan Thompson's wonderful book with that title, Mind in Life. And the first paragraph is simply, I've hiked a lot in the mountains, and sometimes a friend farther up the trail has turned and looked back and encouraged me onward. Such a friendly gesture. Come join me. Watch out for the slippery ice. You can do it. I've often thought about those moments while writing this book, which is about the heights of human potential, about being as wise and strong, happy and loving as any person can ever be. If those heights are like a great mountain, awakening is the magnificent journey that carries you along toward the top. Many real people have gone very far up, the great sages and teachers throughout history, as well as others no one has heard about, and I imagine them turning with a sweet smile and beckoning us to join them. So it's in that spirit that I think, in my opinion at least, it's really important, much as the Buddha admonished people, to not lose sight of whether it's the pinnacle of human possibility, or as he put it, the heartwood of spiritual practice, that unshakable deliverance of mind, and to keep the snowy peaks in view, even as in our current situation, maybe we're slogging along in the swamp. This is not a spiritual bypass. For me, it's about respecting the whole process and heeding the invitation of those who beckon us onward, and also honoring the longings in our own heart and our intuition of our own deepest, truest nature, perhaps covered over with stresses and distractions. To really honor that and listen to that. I think that I'm old enough to remember the 60s and 70s when I grew up, and the sense of possibility, self-actualization, peak experiences, flow, even enlightenment itself. And in our kind of angry and compressed and highly commercial time, it's almost as if that sense of the ultimate possibility has been kind of pushed to the side. And I think it's important to dust it off and heed the call of the Buddha for, as he put it, that unshakable deliverance of mind. There are obviously pitfalls in continuing to aim in that direction, but there are pitfalls in not aiming in that direction and kind of plateauing at, a kind of intermediate level of practice. Part one. Part two, these qualities of interdependence, inner being, a sense of allness, an appreciation of mystery, timelessness, the infinite, the divine, the transcendental perhaps, the sense of being able to really be in the present as a whole person, accepting oneself fully. These might seem esoteric, but they're incredibly useful in the trenches of everyday life. I mean, I'm a practicing therapist. I've spent a lot of time with people dealing with pathologies and dealing with a lot of suffering. And these capacities are not reserved for the chosen few. They're not just for the 2 weeks or 1 week we spent on retreat somewhere, but they're really for everyday life. Similarly, a sense of equanimity, of a sense of contentment and thankfulness for what we have that has not been lost, and in some cases can never be lost, our own deep true nature underneath it all. That equanimity, that warmth of heart, that intersection of compassion and clarity, that capacity for steadiness of mind is also extremely useful for resilient well-being and effective coping for the sake of others as well as oneself. There's a real application of cultivating these qualities in ourselves amidst the challenges of everything. Okay, so with that, as a bit of perspective, wanting to respect your time here, what would you like to talk about? What would be interesting and useful for you? And Susan, do you want to moderate this? Would that be appropriate here?
Sure. Does living on the front edge of now differ from living in the now? Front edge sounds like we are anticipating the future, not the present.
Yeah. So I allowed myself in this book a little more lyrical, kick out the jams, And if I could, I'd like to just frame this with a quotation from Mathieu Ricard, which kind of opens the book. And you may know Mathieu Ricard is both a Tibetan monastic as well as a PhD. I think he's a biologist. He writes, where he said, actually, I thought if I could speak as well as Mathieu Ricard, that would be great. But anyway, he said it. One should learn to let thoughts arise and be freed to go as soon as they arise, instead of letting them invade one's mind. In the freshness of the present moment, the past is gone, the future is not born, and if one remains in pure mindfulness and freedom, potentially disturbing thoughts arise and go without leaving a trace. And there are similar quotations in the Pali Canon from the Buddha about those who, here's one from the Samyutta Nikaya, they do not grieve over the past, nor do they yearn for the future. They live only in the present. That is why their faces are so calm. So we see this teaching, whether it's in the Buddhist tradition or Hindu tradition, Ram Dass, Be Here Now, Eckhart Tolle, people like that, the power of now. The question is, how do we actually do it? And neurologically, there's some very cool science about that. I could go into depth about it. I think I won't right now, but I'll just make the point that first, with the evolution of the neocortex, also the rest of the brain, but especially it over the last several million years, while the brain tripled in volume, much of that capacity has to do with the development of being able to do mental time travel. Imagine a future, reflect upon a past, and that is a great evolutionary adaptation. Cats, we have a cat now from our daughter coming home from New York City. Cats are trapped in the present. Chimpanzees and gorillas are pretty much trapped in the present, for better or worse. We humans have this capacity to reflect on the past and plan the future, which also means we have the capacity to regret the past, to feel ashamed of the past, to resent the past, and also worry about the future, which creates an awful lot of suffering for us. And also that mental time travel tends to be saturated with selfing. So if we're pragmatically interested in suffering less and altering some of the causes and conditions of our suffering and harm for ourselves and for others, it's useful to come into the present and be able to get regulation over that mental time travel. Well, in the brain, coming into the present most immediately involves the activation of ancient attentional networks that are lower down in the brain and right-sided for right-handed people that alert us to whatever's new, something new, something new, something new. Involves an updating of our consciousness, and we can get a feeling of that as if we're surprised by something or a new sound has occurred, and then we just kind of freeze the movie of the last second or two of our life and then review it. We can recognize that feeling of alerting, distinct from orienting to what something is, what it means, and what to do about it, which involve different, more recent attentional networks higher up and on both sides of the brain. So if we train in the capacity to truly receive, as Mathieu was saying, the freshness of the arising moment, as it arises while letting go of it instantaneously, we reduce mental time travel and all the suffering that's involved in that. And we also, if you think about it, don't get so invested in the fourth aggregate, the mental formations or the volitional formations in which so much of our unhappiness resides. But instead, we're living much more in form with some of the feeling tone, the hedonic tones of the Vedanas, as well as perception, what something is, the bare apprehension of our experience. We're kind of living there, and we're not so caught up in the volitional formations with all the suffering of that. Pragmatically, there's a place for mental time travel. We evolved it for a reason. There's a place for, processing. I'm a therapist, processing the volitional formations, but a little bit of that goes a long way. That's why I think it's quite helpful to stimulate again and again the neural circuitry of alerting, that feeling of updating, the freshness of the arising moment, which is also supported by attitudes of delight, beginner's mind, child mind, don't know mind, kind of a disengagement from a not following, not feeding or following, what's arising in awareness, letting it pass on by, as Mathieu says, before it can sink its roots in. And as we train in that capacity for alerting, we become more and more able to kind of rest in it and not be hijacked so frequently with mental time travel. That's an example of some of the ways in which I think it's useful to draw upon our growing understanding of the hardware and how it works, if only to highlight certain aspects of it in our discernment and our understanding of ourselves, our vipassana, our insight into ourselves, aided by some understanding of how the machinery works and certain distinctions in the machinery that help us refine the granularity of our mindful self-awareness of distinctions in our own experience.
Thank you,
I kind of packed a lot into that response too, but I think you got it. Be here now, right?
There. Thank you. We have another question from Chuck.
Great.
Okay, so he said, how long should we meditate daily to achieve the neurological benefits you describe?
That's great. Well, neuroscience is a baby science. The neuroscience of contemplative practice is like the Wild West. It's a frontier. And, new information is coming in, blah, 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 blah. What's interesting is that, first of all, evidence of mental change is evidence of neural change within the natural frame of ordinary reality, right? So if a person is becoming more stably present, if they are more rested in a lovingness or can return to it fairly rapidly, if they get really aggravated by somebody else, if they have a growing sense of equanimity, if they can really reside more and more in a non-dual sense. I think there are three kinds of non-duality. The first kind is experiential, where awareness and its contents are really experienced as a single unified field of consciousness, which I think is, with depth, it becomes the jhana factor of akagata, singleness of mind. As one does that and also more, broadly develops, what's the joke from the Dalai Lama to the hot dog vendor? Please make me one with everything. Evidence of mental change must involve neural change, even if we don't have an MRI study. So all that said, I think observation is that the felt sense of these viharas, these dwelling places, dwelling in the now, dwelling in the present moment, dwelling as yourself as a whole, not compartmentalized. The structure of suffering is parts struggling with parts. So when we open into the whole of ourselves, you can just observe the sense of inner tension and conflict and struggle and dismay and unease gets quieter and quieter. Because when you go out into mind as a whole, consciousness as a whole, it may include pain and sorrow, but that's not a problem. There are no second darts. You're not throwing any second darts when you're opening out into mind as a whole. So as we cultivate, so I think it's important to feel this. Whatever you want to grow is its two-stage process. Neurologically, experience-dependent positive neuroplasticity occurs in two steps. First, we must experience whatever we want to grow. So I would say the more the better. You know, the more moments in a day where you rest in what calls your heart. And to really listen to the longings in our heart, you know, for the highest happiness, however you experience that and conceive of it, to heed those calls and authentically, not denying anything. This is not about positive thinking. It's about cultivation, that aspect of practice, that's development, including the cultivation of the clearing away of the obscurations to our own true nature. I mean, that's the process. So first we must experience whatever we want to grow. And then second, if we want to help it actually change us for the better, fundamentally, in terms of our own progression of practice, we have to help that passing state gradually become hardwired in our bodies as a lasting trait, so that we acquire over time trait mindfulness, trait compassion, trait gratitude, trait equanimity, trait tranquility, trait blissfulness as among the factors of awakening. Trait wise view, right? Trait non-attachment, trait disenchantment, these various factors that the Buddha identified. So that's a two-stage process from state to trait. We usually forget the second step. So that's what I'm well known for. That's the drum I've been beating for 20 years now about taking in the good, about actually helping the experiences we're having to leave lasting residues behind instead of chasing the next shiny object, operating the remote control inside ourselves. So to the point here, my operational question as a really practical guy would be, number one, how often are we experiencing each day whatever it is we hope to grow? Maybe what we hope to grow is letting go. Maybe what we hope to grow is a spaciousness of perspective that recognizes the current time in the larger context of thousands and millions of years, whatever. How often are you experiencing what you want to grow for how long each day? Where does your mind dwell? All right. And then second, to what extent are you helping what you're experiencing to really land inside and sink good roots and, you know, bear fruit over time? To me, that's the key question. So from a neuroscience standpoint, you know, I think the takeaway from a lot of studies, I'm curious what John might say, John Shorling, but I think the takeaway from a lot of studies is summarized in two fundamental words: mo better. More episodes, more moments when we experience something wholesome, useful, beneficial, valuable, wise, sincere. And second, mo better, more depth of engagement. A breath at a time, you know, a minute at a time, more depth of engagement with these beneficial experiences so that gradually, increasingly, they really become the habit of our heart. So there's no quick answer. My minimum, you know, is a minute or more a day of real practice, and then 5 minutes or more a day of real practice. For many people, it's really hard for them to practice for 5 real minutes a day. And even if it's 10 seconds here and 2 minutes there, but 5 minutes total is a push. But if you can do that, that's a really good start, and then build from there.
Thank you. So we have a question here from Betty, and she asks, do all forms of meditation change the brain in the same way?
Great question. So many people would like to know. And okay, so if you look at this research on it, it's kind of messy, but it's cool. And for one, you start to see, much as in psychotherapy, if you will, those of you in helping professions or other forms of helping professions, there are common factors. So there are different meditations. And I think, let's be really clear, I suspect that the majority of people in the world in the last 24 hours who've done some form of contemplative practice, something meditative, have done so in the form of prayer, in relationship to something that for them at least is conceived of as divine or transpersonal or transcendental. So I think that's important to include in terms of forms of contemplative practice. Meditation doesn't just occur in a secular frame. That said, if you think of the regulation of attention, body awareness, emotional regulation, and shift of sense of self, those four aspects are pretty fundamental to almost any kind of contemplative practice. And research does show that the brains of people who engage contemplative practice repeatedly and at least 5 minutes a day, and most days of the week, and usually hopefully more minutes than 5, actually have measurable changes in neural structure and function having to do with parts of the brain that regulate attention, regulate emotions, deepen internal interoceptive body awareness, and broaden and relax the sense of self. You definitely see that. What gets also interesting is distinctions around concentration practices, distinct from open awareness practices. That tends to get studied. Also, practices that are more devotional, or you could say juicy. They tend to, or like piti, rapture, bliss practices, gratitude practices, sukha in Pali. Those kind of practices tend to engage parts of the brain that are more involved in reward and deeper regions in the basal ganglia. I'll finish on this point. Again, these studies are suggestive. It's the Wild West. There may be gold in them hills. There may be just fool's gold in them hills. But you start to have different fingers pointing at what seems like the same moon. Maybe there's a moon really there, right? So I think it was a study done on, I believe, Carmelite nuns in Quebec in Canada doing a devotional practice that's very Christian. And a key part of the brain, the caudate nucleus and the basal ganglia, became active, and it's a reward center in the brain. And that same part of the brain gets active when people take cocaine or win the lottery. I'm not saying that these nuns were taking cocaine, but they were feeling really richly rewarded in this devotional practice of, loving Christ, perhaps, a deeply meaningful spiritual experience for them. So you start to see differences in what gets activated. It kind of makes sense based on different practices. I'll finish my own. I feel fairly modest about myself as a meditation teacher. There are people who are much more experienced in this than I am. And I do it, I have background in it, and I'm sincere about it, but I try to be a little modest about it. In the frame of that modesty, I think much like exercise, the best meditative technique is the one you will actually do. It's the one you actually use. That's the one, and that's the one to keep going with, right? The one that you'll actually do, that draws you, that feeds you, and seems to be helping you over time.
Here's another question, Rick, and it's from Phyllis. And she asks, how is our intuition explained neurologically?
Wow. Descartes and others have gotten, partly a question is, are we resorting to supernatural and or transcendental causes and conditions for part of the explanation? That's a key distinction right there. So when some people refer to intuition, they're implying for them, there's something supernatural involved, some way to know the future, some information from past lives, some entity speaking to them, and that's how they think about it. Or even if not, some transcendental process moving through them, informing them intuitively. Okay. Whatever might be true about that, and I'm going to stay inside the natural frame here, how do we account for intuition inside the frame of science, right? And that's where it gets, again, people, how you define intuition. A key, for one, I think this distinction that I just made is really important because it becomes really messy if we don't track that distinction. Okay. Inside the natural frame, a lot of what appears to be intuition is a kind of eruption into our awareness that, particularly in modern times, tends to be dominated verbally, with a knowing that seems to be nonverbal in its roots, with imagery, things put together in a way that is hard to really account for logically. And the notions that I've read about that, and I think they're mostly just really notions, no one really knows for sure, is that there's an openness to the intelligence of the right hemisphere of the brain, or deeper, in evolutionary terms, levels within us and in the brain that are not very verbal. It's really, to me, humbling and appreciated. I mean, I use words for a living a lot. The verbal centers of the brain are a tiny fraction of the total volume of the brain, and they're really recent. They're just kind of laid on top. And we tend to privilege the word and idolize it, I think, and idealize it, but it's just one small part of the total streaming of consciousness. And I would say for me, one of the things that's happened it's a little bit like, the raft, the Buddha's metaphor of the raft. We face a river of suffering, we construct a raft to get to the other side. But once you get to the other side, you don't keep carrying the raft around, right? You move on. For me, I've really gone a long way with the raft of words and logic. And it's one thing I've really come to appreciate in my long journey with words and logic is their limitations and their partiality, and the ways we can become trapped by them, and the importance of really appreciating somatic, emotional, intuitive, nonverbal, distributed ways of experiencing and knowing. And I think intuition is an example of that. We use words to go beyond words.
Thank you. So another question. You talk here, we're talking a great deal about cultivating these qualities, these beautiful qualities. A lot of people talk about non-doing, pointing out there's a contradiction because in cultivating qualities, there's an I who is doing that. And so how do you discuss the non-doing?
Yep. It's a fantastic question. Central critique has to be addressed, right? How do we address it? Right. Well, first, there's the key distinction between the school of, in other words, how do we engage practice? Do we engage it as a matter of resting in and uncovering our true nature? Or do we engage practice as a matter of purification, development, training? And that distinction is found a lot in the tension between the Theravadan and the Mahayana schools. I think it's also summarized in the Tibetan saying, gradual cultivation, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, sudden awakening. In other words, for me, the two go together. Both are true, and clearly both are highly present in the Buddhist teachings as found in the Pali Canon, which are mainly about cultivation.
Yes.
Mainly about cultivation, the gradual, the path, the Eightfold Path, the gradual developmental process of awakening. How that shows up for me is that we do both. We cultivate ourselves so that the awakenings, the breakthroughs that occur, do not suck us into a psychotic vortex or are one of these one-off amazing experiences that actually make no lasting difference, but so that there's a basis for those transformative experiences to land. And then as we experience them, maybe on retreat, or in some kind of deep training, maybe with psychedelics. We have those experiences, and then we backfill in the infrastructure we cultivate to help them really land and stabilize and be with us. Right? And so I think that the Buddha distinguished between tanha and chanda, between craving, tanha, whose root meaning is thirst, grounded in a sense of deficit and disturbance, something missing, something wrong. That's problematic. That's a problematic form of desire. On the other hand, he named and repeatedly pointed out the importance of healthy desire. You know, the wish that others be happy is a form of desire. To have wise intention, to renounce attachment to pleasure is a form of desire. To release ill will, to intend to, in wise intention, abandon ill will toward others is a form of desire. To wish that children be fed and that we get a grip on the coronavirus, plague that's spreading around the world. Those are desires. It's okay to have desire. There's no problem with desire per se. There's no problem with identifying that, feeding children is better than starving them. I think it's kind of silly to get caught up in mental gymnastics like, oh, desire is bad. No, the question is, are the ends wholesome? Are they pursued with wholesome, skillful means while being ultimately at peace with whatever happens? To me, that characterizes wise desire. And in that, yes, there is a dualism that's inherent. We're going there rather than here. We think feeding children is better than the current situation in which many children go to bed hungry around the world every night. That's okay. And in all that, there are executive functions of different kinds. There is purposefulness. There is a sense of willfulness. There is even the wholesome desire of one's own welfare. I mean, we are not left out in the benevolent wish that all beings be free from suffering and live, and be safe, healthy, happy, and live with ease. We're included in that. It's okay to have all that. So I think it's really clear. We can have wholesome intentions, beneficial aims. We can pursue them skillfully, not a problem per se. There's not a problem inherent in that. Problems arise in our relationship to that when we get attached to outcomes, driven about it to a fault. If I have one addiction, it's to eliminating items on my to-do list. So I have to really watch out for that. But wholesome desire per se is not a problem, nor is it a problem to have a quality of willfulness and purposefulness and a certain amount of recognition of how this will affect oneself. Where it gets problematic, and I think the person who asked the question knows and is really very wisely pointing to, is when we get me, myself, and I, my precious, caught up in that, right? And in the chapter on allness, that's because I'm clustering topics in 7 buckets, not self, anatta, the release of self, holding self more and more lightly. That's explored in the chapter on allness. Yeah. In other words, clearly there's a person who is pursuing wholesome aims. I've done a lot of rock climbing. There's a person who's, holding on to holds. There's a person who's pulling a child back from a bus, on a busy street, accomplishing a wholesome aim. That's not a problem. We are persons. I'm a person. Susan's a person. John's a person. Jean's a person. We're persons. We're a mind-body process that is meaningfully distinct from other mind-body processes, patterning allness along the way as it flows through the banks of the unconditioned. Just because there are pitfalls in conceit and self and the presumption of a brick-like, unified, enduring, independent entity inside, there are certainly pitfalls with that. Well, we should avoid those pitfalls and practice with those as best we can, while in wholesome ways, giving ourselves over to noble purposes, ennobling truths like the Buddha taught, that's okay. That's really okay. And I think to finish in my view, because this is something I've had to think a lot about, partly because of my own interests around cultivation. How do we cultivate without falling into the pitfalls of selfing and striving and comparing and and I think it's important to appreciate there are pitfalls on both sides. There are pitfalls in having too much of a fix-it orientation to one's own mind and too much of a stressful gaining mind, in life on the one hand. On the other hand, there are pitfalls in taking what are designed to be meditative procedures or practices, such as the practice of no gaining mind in Shikantaza, Zen meditation, say, in the Soto school especially, or the meditative technique of choiceless awareness. When we turn those into a way of life before they are really completely fulfilled, I think is also a pitfall. And I think there's been an overemphasis. I've observed, I've been involved in mindfulness and meditation for like 45 years-ish. I think there's been a kind of dogmatic ideology that's crept in that dismisses dogmatically and even almost disdainfully practices of cultivation and wise effort laid out by the Buddha. And I think that's an error. And I think it's also an error to fail to recognize that mindfulness is to be present under all conditions, including while making wise efforts. Mindfulness is not at odds with making wise efforts in the mind or with other people. We are mindful while we release what is harmful and problematic, and we're mindful while we grow the good, while we cultivate the wholesome inside ourselves. Just because only mindfulness is present when we're in the most radical forms of choiceless awareness, when it would be problematic to engage wise efforts. Wise effort is at odds with choiceless awareness. And choiceless awareness is fantastic. It's profound. But until we can utterly abide in choiceless awareness 24/7, right? We have some work to do. And if we're to do that work, that gradual purification and that gradual abiding more and more stably in what calls our heart, we need to engage wise efforts, and we need to be mindful while we are doing that work each step of the way.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Difficult question. Yes.
Yeah. What do you all?
So
I wish we had time. Yeah. What do you all make of this?
Great.
But you got to go. So
I do too. But before we do go, I want to not only thank you, but I want to mention that Rick has come today to visit us very, very generously. He's given his time freely. And usually when we're at IMCC, we have a Dana basket at the back of the room. Today we do not. We have a virtual Dana basket. And we invite you, please, if you would be willing to show your appreciation and the practice of generosity. The link actually to Rick's Dana basket appears at the very beginning of the chat function at the top of that. We also have put it www.rickhanson.net teaching/Wednesday meditations with Dr. Rick Hanson. You can either click there or else you can go on our website, and in both places we have that link. So your Dana tonight, your generosity will go 100% to Rick, whatever you care and choose to donate, and would be much, much appreciated. Thank you all so much for coming, and especially Rick, thank you for visiting us. It's really been a real pleasure. Yeah, and it's great to see you again. Yeah.
And if I could, it's great to do this.
You have something else.
Hang out more often. And I want to thank you all.
Okay, we're going to take you up on that.
The Dana of your attention. No, listen, I thank you for the Dana of your attention, the Dana of your graciousness. really, the generosity of you including me. I thank you for all of that very, very much, including my benefactors, Susan and John. Thank you.
Blessings, Rick, and to all of us.
Take good care.